The Ottawa Heart Institute smelled like recycled air and someone's forgotten coffee. Soren Malik had been sitting in the cardiology waiting room for 11 minutes, which was 11 minutes longer than he'd planned. The board call had run over. The 417 had been a disaster. Now he was wedged between a rubber plant that had seen better days and a man who kept opening and closing a crossword puzzle without writing anything down. He had 3 emails that needed answers, a quarterly report due by end of day, and a cardiologist appointment he'd already rescheduled twice. This was the 3rd attempt. The receptionist, young, efficient, wearing a lanyard with a cartoon moose on it, called out a name. "Mrs. Pruitt, we're ready for you. Is your family member here yet?" Soren glanced up from his phone. Across the waiting room, a woman in her late 70s was already on her feet, gathering her coat and a small, worn, cloth-covered book from the seat beside her. She moved carefully, the way people do when their joints have opinions. She looked at the receptionist, then at the door, then back at the receptionist, and her expression did something complicated. She was hoping someone would walk through that door. Nobody did. The receptionist smiled patiently. "We can go in without." "He's here," Soren heard himself say. He wasn't sure why he said it. He was already standing. The woman turned and looked directly at him with a kind of expression that asked about 15 questions at once. He crossed the waiting room in 4 steps and said quietly, "If you need someone." She studied him for a moment, small, white-haired, with the posture of a woman who had spent decades telling children to sit up straight. She looked like she was deciding whether to accept help or decline it with dignity. "You're not my son," she said. "No," Soren agreed. "He's in Vancouver." "I gathered." She glanced at his suit, bespoke, probably too expensive for an Ottawa Thursday morning, and said, "You look like you have somewhere to be." "I'm also seeing cardiology, just not right now." A beat. Then she straightened slightly and said, "Well, you'd better come along then." The cardiologist, Dr. Fawcett, a methodical woman with a gray streak in her braid, explained what Soren had already half understood from the waiting room. Mild arrhythmia, controlled, not dangerous, but the patient should not be alone if episodes recurred. "The important thing," Dr. Fawcett said, looking at Soren with the relief that comes from having a second adult in the room, was that someone knew what to watch for. Soren nodded. He asked 2 sensible questions. He received 2 sensible answers. The woman, Estelle Pruitt, he gathered from the file folder, sat beside him with her hands folded over the cloth-covered book in her lap and her expression exactly neutral, the way someone looks when they've decided not to feel embarrassed. Afterward, standing on the pavement outside the Institute, Soren said, "Can I call you a cab or—" "I take the bus." She was already wrapping her scarf. "You've done enough. The 85 doesn't run for another 20 minutes. She paused. "How would you know that?" "I used to take it from work, before I moved the office." She looked at him, really looked, the way older people sometimes do, like they have more practice seeing past surfaces. "You moved the office." "We outgrew the building on Albert Street." She began walking toward the bus shelter. "I used to teach in a building on Albert Street, piano lessons." He fell into step beside her. The November air was sharp, the kind that got into your collar. She walked steadily, the address book tucked under one arm. "How long did you teach?" he asked. 38 years, long enough to know which children were practicing and which ones were lying about it. A pause. "You hold your hands like someone who used to play." He glanced down at his hands. "My mother had me take lessons until I was 15. And then? And then I decided hockey was more important." "Of course you did," she said without judgment. "They all do." At the bus shelter there was a bench. She sat. He sat beside her, and they were both quiet for a moment, which was the kind of quiet that happens after something slightly strange and slightly real. "I'm Soren Malik," he said. "Estelle Pruitt." She didn't offer her hand, but she said his name back to herself quietly, like she was filing it somewhere. "Your parents named you Soren." "My mother did. She was Norwegian." "Was." "She died 4 years ago." Estelle looked at the street. "I'm sorry," she said. Not the reflexive version, the actual one. The bus was 6 minutes away, according to his phone. He put it back in his pocket. "Your son," he said. "You called ahead and told them he'd be coming." "I called ahead and told them someone would be coming." She watched a pigeon investigate a parking meter. "I didn't specify." Has he been to appointments with you before? He came to Edmund's funeral. She said it flatly. That was 18 months ago. Soren said nothing. He has a busy life, Estelle said. He runs a company in Vancouver, some kind of logistics firm. I don't entirely understand what it does. How often do you talk? When one of us calls. She paused. Neither of us calls very much. The bus arrived. She stood, and he stood with her. You don't have to, she said. I know. He waited while she climbed on and touched her transit card to the reader. Then he followed. He didn't plan to go back. But 3 days later he found himself on Gladstone Avenue in the Glebe, looking at a narrow brick house, with a window box of dead marigolds and a front step that needed repointing. He had her address because he'd written it down when the hospital asked for next of kin contact information, and he'd given his own number, and the receptionist had asked for an address, and Estelle had given hers before realizing what she was doing. He knocked. She opened the door in a house dress and reading glasses and said, I thought you'd be taller. We're the same height. Precisely. She stepped back. Come in if you're coming. The house was full of the particular warmth of a place that has been lived in for a long time. Sheet music on the side table. Photographs on the bookshelves, black and white mixing with color, a broad-faced man named Edmund visible in several. He looked like he laughed easily. A piano in the sitting room, a Baldwin upright, its lid open, a metronome sitting on top like a patient sentry. She made tea without asking if he wanted any. He sat at the kitchen table and noticed the address book was there, open. The entries were handwritten in a small, precise script, and he could see from where he sat that several names on the visible page had been gently crossed out in pencil. You're looking at my book, she said without turning around. Sorry. It's all right. People always look. She set the cups down and sat across from him. My sister gave it to me in 1974. I've had to tape the spine twice. Every time someone dies, I cross them out, just with pencil, softly. She looked at it. I don't like to use pen, it seems too final. Is that why you use pencil? No, it's because I've never been able to find a pen when I need one. She picked up her cup. That was a joke. He smiled. She looked satisfied. You're not what I expected, Estelle said. What did you expect? Someone who'd feel better about themselves for helping and then move on. She sipped her tea. That's usually how these things go. I'm not sure I feel better about myself. Then why did you come back? He thought about it honestly. I haven't sat in a kitchen in 4 years, he said. Not like this, not without an agenda. Estelle looked at him for a long moment. You need a biscuit, she said, and got up to find one. He started coming on Wednesdays. He didn't plan it that way. The first few times were coincidental, or nearly so. But by the 3rd week it was simply Wednesday, and he was on Gladstone Avenue, and Estelle had started putting the kettle on when she heard his car. She never asked about his company. He found this unusual. Most people asked within the first 10 minutes. She asked about his mother, what she cooked, whether she'd made him take his shoes off at the door. She asked about the hockey he'd chosen over piano, and he told her about a broken collarbone, and she said naturally, with exactly the right amount of satisfaction. He learned that she'd come to Ottawa from New Brunswick in 1969, that she'd met Edmund at a church choir she'd joined specifically because she was bored, and Edmund had joined specifically because he couldn't sing and wanted to improve, that they'd had their son Terence in 1972, and that Edmund had tried to teach the boy piano and failed, and that Terence had grown up good at numbers and uncomfortable with sentiment, which was probably, Estelle said, her fault as much as Edmund's. Why yours? Soren asked. Estelle set her cup down, because I was the one who was home, and I taught other people's children how to express themselves through music for 38 years, and then I came home and couldn't find a way to say to my own son that I thought he was remarkable. She said this matter-of-factly, the way people talk about mistakes they've almost made peace with. Soren thought of his own mother, who had driven 4 hours to see him open his first office, and whom he had thanked for 15 minutes before taking a call that lasted 40. He thought of the last time he'd spoken to her before she was admitted to hospital. He'd been in an airport. He'd had a flight to catch. He'd said he'd call back when he landed. He looked at the address book on the corner of the table, where it always sat when he visited. May I? He asked. She nodded. He opened it carefully. The entries were alphabetical, precise, some going back decades, dresses in old postal codes, phone numbers that started with exchanges he didn't recognize. The crossed-out names were gentle, just as she'd said. And then, toward the back, he found the folded pages. They were tucked into the rear pocket of the book, the way you'd tuck a receipt into a wallet. A dozen sheets, maybe more, all in the same small, careful script. "Terence," the first one began. "The Cardinal came back to the feeder this morning. The red one. Edmund used to say." Soren stopped reading. He looked up. Estelle was watching him without apology. "You don't send them," he said. "No." "How long have you been writing them?" She considered. "Edmund died in March, so about 19 months. "Why haven't you sent them?" She was quiet for a moment. Outside, a delivery truck backed slowly past the window. She waited until the sound was gone. "Because if I send them and he doesn't write back," she said, "then I'll know." She looked at her hands. "And I've gotten very comfortable not knowing." The thing about Wednesdays was that Soren started leaving his phone in his coat pocket. Not every time, not all at once. The first few weeks he checked it constantly, the way you check a wound. But somewhere around mid-December he realized he'd spent an entire hour at that kitchen table without looking at it once, and the hour had passed like the right kind of hour, the kind that leaves something behind. His chief of staff commented that he looked less like he was calculating something when he came back on Wednesday afternoons. He didn't explain. Estelle showed him Edmund's workshop in the basement, a tidy workbench with hand tools hanging in outlines painted on pegboard. A half-finished birdhouse, a small brass clock 3 inches tall that Edmund had been meaning to repair since 1998. "He fixed everything," she said, picking it up. "The dishwasher, the fence posts, my mother's old sewing machine. He just never got around to this one." She set it back down. "I wound it for 3 months after he died, even though it doesn't run. Then I stopped. Then I started again." She said it simply, but Soren stood at Edmund's workbench for another minute, looking at the stopped clock, before he trusted himself to speak. "Have you thought about having it repaired?" "I've thought about a lot of things." She was already climbing the stairs. "Soup's probably ready." In January, Estelle fell. Nothing serious. She caught her foot on the bath mat, grabbed the towel bar, held on. No injury, no hospital. But she mentioned it in passing, the way she mentioned most difficult things, between 2 other sentences, as if it might not be noticed. Soren noticed. He had the bath mat replaced and 3 grab bars professionally installed within a week. Estelle was irritated about this in a way that communicated gratitude. "I would have told you before you did it," she said. "I know. You would have said not to bother." "That would have been my right." "Yes." She looked at the grab bars. "Edmund would have put those in himself and done a crooked job and been very pleased with himself about it. I'm sorry it's not crooked." She made a sound that was either disapproval or amusement. It was hard to tell with Estelle, which he'd come to understand was entirely intentional. That afternoon, while she was on the phone with someone from her former church, Soren sat at the kitchen table and found himself opening the back pocket of the address book. He read all of the letters this time. 19 months of them, the Cardinal. A recipe for butter tarts she thought Terence might remember from childhood. A winter storm that reminded her of a power outage in 1983 when Terence had been 10 and Edmund had made popcorn on the camp stove. And they'd played cards by flashlight, and it had been, she wrote, one of the best nights she could remember, and she'd never told either of them so. An apology, careful and precise, for not coming to Vancouver when Terence's marriage ended. She'd wanted to. She hadn't known how to step into the silence of it without making things worse. "I should have come," she wrote. "I know you would have said it wasn't necessary. I should have come anyway." Near the bottom of the last letter, one line, underlined. "Your father was proud of you. He didn't know how to say so, neither did I. I'm saying it now, even though you won't read this." Soren folded the letters back exactly as he'd found them and sat at the kitchen table until Estelle came back. When she sat down, he said, "He needs to read them." She looked at the book. "I know." "Will you send them?" She was quiet for a long time, long enough that the kettle began to bubble again, and she got up and turned it off and came back and sat down. "I'm 79 years old," she said. "I've been afraid of a lot of things and done them anyway. I'm allowed one." Soren said nothing. He'd learned, in 2 months, that silence with Estelle was not the same as agreement. And she'd learned that about him, too. What would you do, she asked, not testing him, actually asking. He thought about airports, about unanswered calls, about 4 years of a conversation that had never happened. I'd send them, he said, not because it will go well, because you'll spend the rest of your life knowing you didn't. She looked at him. Did someone tell you that once? I worked it out on my own, he said. Too late to use it. She reached out and put her hand over his, briefly, the way his mother used to do when she was telling him something she meant. Then she took the address book and went to find an envelope. Terence Pruitt arrived on a gray Thursday in late February. Estelle hadn't told Soren he was coming. He found out because he drove past the house on Gladstone on his way back from a lunch meeting, passed it for half a block before he turned around without entirely knowing why, and saw a rental car in the driveway with a BC plate. He sat in his own car across the street for a few minutes. Then he drove away. She called him that evening. He came, she said. I know. I saw the car. You drove past. I was in the neighborhood. She made the sound that could be disapproval or amusement, and this time he was fairly sure it was both. He stayed for 6 hours. He brought me flavored coffee from the airport because he didn't know what else to bring. How was it? There was a long pause. He could hear the faint sound of the piano in the background, just a few notes, like she'd touched the keys while walking past. He read the letters, she said. He sat at this table and read all of them and didn't say anything for a long time. Her voice was steady, but carefully so. And then he said, Mom, I didn't know you felt this way. She paused, and I said, that's rather the point of not sending them. Soren laughed. He couldn't help it. And then he laughed too, she said. He has Edmund's laugh. I'd forgotten. Is he coming back? He changed his return ticket. She said this like a minor administrative update. He's staying until Sunday. He's sleeping in his old room, which I haven't changed since 1991, so he's very uncomfortable, and he would never say so. That sounds right. Yes, she said, it does. On the last Sunday of February, Soren arrived at Gladstone Avenue to find Estelle and Terence Pruitt at the kitchen table with the remnants of a large breakfast and a disagreement about the correct way to make oatmeal that was clearly standing in for a much longer conversation they were still finding their way into. Terence was a broad-faced man in his early 50s with his mother's precision about language, and Edmund's laugh, which Soren heard within the first 3 minutes. He stood when Soren came in, a generational marker, and shook his hand with the formality of someone meeting a person his mother had mentioned, in terms he hadn't quite sorted out yet. She says you showed up at her cardiology appointment, Terence said. I was in the waiting room. And you just... She needed someone. Terence looked at his mother. She was refilling the coffee pot and not appearing to listen, which meant she was listening carefully. Thank you, Terence said, simply like he meant it. Estelle set the coffee down and said, he's going to set up video calls, weekly. She said this to Soren, not to Terence. I told him I don't know how to do video calls, and he said he'd walk me through it, which means he'll talk very slowly and I'll have to resist the urge to hang up on him. That's accurate, Terence said without offense. We'll see, Estelle said, and the way she said it was different from how she'd said it before about other uncertain things. It had room in it now. Before Soren left that afternoon, Estelle pressed the address book into his hands. He looked at it. I shouldn't. Want you to have it for a while. I've been carrying other people's addresses for 50 years. She folded his hands around it. It needs a break. You'll want it back. Obviously, she patted his hands once, briskly, but not until spring. He kept it on his desk, tucked to one side between a paperweight and a small framed photograph of his mother that he'd moved from storage to his office in November and hadn't been able to explain precisely why. He was aware of it when he sat down in the morning and when he left at night. In March, he returned to the Ottawa Heart Institute for his follow-up. His stress results from the autumn had been borderline. Nothing urgent, his cardiologist had said, but worth monitoring, worth reconsidering certain habits. He'd reconsidered a few of them. He still worked long hours, but he had Wednesdays now. He arrived early. First time in recent memory that he'd arrived early to anything voluntary. The waiting room looked the same. Rubber plant, recycled air, forgotten coffee. A man with a crossword puzzle he wasn't filling in. Soren sat and looked at his phone and didn't open anything. Across the room, a young woman sat with her knees pressed together and her hands in her lap, watching the door the way Estelle had watched it in November. 26, maybe 27. A winter coat a size too big, the kind that's a hand-me-down. She was alone. The receptionist called her name. "Is your family member here yet?" The young woman started to shake her head. Soren was already standing. He crossed the room. She looked up at him, startled, tired-looking, with the particular expression of someone who has been managing something difficult by themselves for too long. "I'm not who you're waiting for," he said quietly. "But if you need someone in there, I'm not in a hurry." She stared at him. "Why would you?" "Someone did this for a friend of mine," he said, more or less. She looked at the receptionist, then back at him. Then slowly, she nodded. That evening he drove to Gladstone Avenue with no particular reason and let himself in. Estelle had given him a key in January for reasons she'd framed as purely practical, and found her at the piano, not practicing, just playing, from memory, something slow and old that he half recognized. She finished the phrase and looked up. "How is cardiology?" "Good results." He sat in the armchair by the window. There was someone in the waiting room. I sat with her. Estelle played another few bars. "Did you give her your number in case she needs anything?" He had, in fact. Yes. Good. She moved into something that sounded like it might become a hymn and then changed its mind. "You're learning." He smiled at the window. The February light had started lasting longer. The marigold box was still empty, but Estelle had mentioned last week that she was thinking of planting something different this year. On the kitchen table, the address book sat open to a new page. His name was written at the top in her careful script, above 2 lines she'd added that week. His office address, his mobile number. Below that, the page was blank, a long, unhurried blank, the kind that means there is still time. He left it there when he went home that night. Some things are meant to be filled slowly, and that is not a problem. That is, in fact, the whole point. If Estelle Pruitt taught him anything in those Wednesday afternoons on Gladstone Avenue, it was this. The people we love most are rarely the ones we were assigned. They are the ones who showed up when we didn't ask them to, who stayed long after they had any reason to, who wrote letters in the back of old address books because they couldn't bear the silence of saying nothing. Family is not inherited. It is chosen and kept, and chosen again every ordinary week. If this story stayed with you today, please consider subscribing to Deep Stirring Stories. We'd love to hear from you in the comments. If you had been sitting in that waiting room, would you have stood up?